No single weapon matches the flexibility, power, and capability of an aircraft carrier and its air wing. Experience life on and above the flight deck as it was about 40 years ago. This supercarrier, deployed on one of the world's 7 seas, carried over 5,000 officers and crew for more than 6 months. A fast-moving, self-sufficient floating airbase, it is remarkable in its design. As one commander put it, steering the ship is like guiding Manhattan from atop the Empire State Building. Even more impressive is the precision required to operate it effectively, despite its confined space. A veteran pilot likened the flight deck to O'Hare and Washington National Airports at peak hours, crammed into a few basketball courts. A dangerous, high-pressure environment where inches or lapses can be catastrophic. Yet, he described it as the most formidable floating weapon system ever created. Aircraft carriers proved their worth in World War II. Then in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. Over the years, the aircraft carrier has adopted and refined numerous advanced technologies. Nuclear power has granted it unlimited range and unmatched mobility. The canted or angled deck, pioneered by the British and introduced to the US Navy in 1952, has greatly enhanced flight deck efficiency and safety for both pilots and crew. Pilots no longer face parked aircraft upon landing, and a missed arrestment now simply results in a touch-and-go maneuver. The steam catapult, another British innovation, has increased launch power over 6-fold compared to older hydraulic systems. This advancement has expanded the number and weight of aircraft carriers can deploy, significantly boosting their strike capabilities. The landing signal officer, once guiding incoming aircraft with paddles, has been replaced by advanced systems like the Fresnel Optical Landing System, or Meatball, and a heads-up display console. These technologies provide pilots with precise, real-time guidance under any lighting, weather, or sea conditions. This sophisticated technology enables the most concentrated offensive airborne firepower from a sea-based airbase. The carrier houses an air wing of over 75 aircraft, organized into 9 or 10 squadrons, each equipped with specialized aircraft for distinct offensive or defensive missions. The carrier's mission is to position its air wing near threats, delivering strikes against targets and intercepting hostile platforms in any weather. While the air wing defends the carrier, the ship itself depends on its accompanying vessels for support. Affectionately called the boat by its crew, the carrier operates as the centerpiece of a battle group, often comprising up to a dozen warships. Each vessel has a specific mission, interconnected through an extensive network of electronic data links, enabling coordination across hundreds of miles. The battle group's submarine, missile cruisers, frigates, and supply ships carry out individual and integrated missions, extending the group's operational range far beyond the horizon. While the carrier departs with all essentials, resupplies ranging from food and jet fuel to ordnance, medical supplies, and replacement parts can be delivered thousands of miles away. Resupply ships rendezvous with the group whenever needed, ensuring sustained operations. The carrier's crew includes both the air wing personnel and permanent ship staff who maintain its complex systems. When not deployed, the air wing operates from naval air stations across the U.S., undergoing rigorous training cycles to refine the teamwork essential for integrated operations. Simulators allow aircrews to master skills such as cockpit procedures, nighttime carrier landings, and advanced combat maneuvers in highly realistic environments. Training culminates at locations like Fallen Naval Air Station in Nevada, where squadrons unite as an air wing, honing their ability to fight as a team. Practice includes simulated combat against other aircraft types, replicating enemy fighters, and tactics to prepare for real-world scenarios. Intercepts and strikes, coordinated with electronic jamming and deception, are carried out on ranges against ground targets, defended by simulated SAMs and missile sites. The results are analyzed using Cubic Corporation's real-time visual displays, identifying who succeeded and who didn't. At the Strike Warfare Center School, the Carrier Air Wing undergoes 3 weeks of non-stop flying. Following integrated training at Fallon, the Air Wing must pass a final evaluation, demonstrating operational readiness over several weeks at sea before overseas deployment. However, the true measure of success lies in the ongoing performance of the officers and crew operating at sea. During air operations, the rescue helicopter is the first to leave the deck, hovering on standby near the ship. Tankers position overhead to provide refueling support at any time, day or night. For fully integrated missions, the E-2C Hawkeye, equipped with its powerful radar rotodome, takes station to monitor threats hundreds of miles away. Using voice or silent data links, it directs the fleet's fighters to intercept and neutralize dangers.
You're clear to fire.
The variable sweep F-14 Tomcat follows, designed for all-weather fleet air defense and air support. Capable of engaging threats from sea level to over 80,000 feet and at ranges exceeding 700 nautical miles, one of its key roles is neutralizing enemy bombers before they can launch cruise missiles. Despite extensive onshore training, pilots continue practicing air combat maneuvers, or ACM, while deployed at sea.
14,000. 2 miles. Anybody? Fights on, fights on.
Here, 2 F-14s engage an F-16 and an A-4, both acting as adversaries. These training sessions occur either at sea or over simulated enemy territory and continue throughout a deployment to ensure maximum readiness.
Alright, I got cover to the right, pretty high. Tower 1, blue going, I got visual. The F-16. Good, Dave. Down low, I'm looking for him. Alright, tower. Hard right, 3 o'clock, hold on. 3 o'clock, high, down.
The A-6E Intruder serves as the Air Wing's low-level, all-weather, long-range attack bomber. Crewed by a pilot and a bombardier navigator, or BN, it can carry missiles, rockets, and bombs. Capable of delivering 5 2,000-pound bombs or up to 28 500-pound bombs, It strikes targets concealed by darkness or adverse weather. Supporting strike aircraft, the EA-6B Prowler plays a vital role in fleet defense. Equipped with advanced electronic countermeasures, it shields the carrier battle group from long-range bombers and radar-guided anti-ship missiles. It also clears the way for Navy and Marine Corps strike aircraft by disorienting enemy air defenses through jamming or destroying them with HARM missiles. The FA-18 Hornet, the newest addition to the Navy and Marine Corps, functions as a versatile strike fighter for carrier air wings. The FA-18 Hornet, entering service in 1983, is a multi-mission tactical aircraft designed from the ground up for both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. Available in single and two-seat versions, its twin engines provide 36,000 pounds of thrust, enabling a combat radius of over 400 nautical miles and a top speed exceeding Mach 1.8. The Hornet's versatility includes roles such as air superiority, fighter escort, suppression of enemy air defenses, reconnaissance, forward air control, close air support, and day or night strike missions. Its adaptability makes it one of the most versatile combat aircraft in service. During the Gulf War, FA-18s often executed both fighter and strike missions in a single sortie. The A-7 Corsair, the Hornet's predecessor, was a powerful carrier fleet asset. Armed with a 20mm cannon, it could carry air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles along with general-purpose bombs. The S-3 Viking, with a crew of 4, excels in anti-submarine warfare under any weather conditions. It can deploy mines, strike ships over the horizon with Harpoon missiles, and refuel other aircraft via a buddy store. The Viking carries 60 sonar buoys and can operate 1,000 miles from its base for over 2 hours without refueling. The SH-3 Sea King, a twin-turbine helicopter with a crew of 4, detects, identifies, tracks, and neutralizes enemy submarines using dipping sonar. It also performs search and rescue missions and cargo transfers. Finally, the Carrier Onboard Delivery, or COD, aircraft provides long-range transport for jet engines, critical spare parts, personnel, and mail, ensuring vital supplies and morale reach the crew at sea. While carriers may vary in structure and layout, the heart of their operation lies on the flight deck, often referred to as the roof. Here, 4 steam catapults launch aircraft with enough velocity for flight, while 4 arresting wires safely capture returning planes. Overseeing this critical hub is the air boss, identifiable by his yellow shirt. A commander and veteran pilot, the air boss combines the roles of ground and air traffic controller, airport manager, and safety officer. Assisting him is the mini-boss, another experienced aviator. Together, they bear ultimate responsibility for the safe launch and recovery of all aircraft. The air boss operates from PriFly, short for Primary Flight Control, a glass and steel enclosure extending from the superstructure, offering an unparalleled view 140 feet above the sea. Commander Greg Southgate, the air boss on the U.S. Constellation, succinctly describes his role, ensuring everything is done by the book.
I have a very large communications suit that enables me to talk to all the people I have to talk to, including the aircraft, obviously, to do all this coordination. And I also have a lot of windows to watch the deck and to see the way we do things, to make sure it's safe, to make sure that we're not going to run one airplane into another. We work in very, very close quarters with our aircraft. So we track the airplanes when they launch to make sure that we get them all back. We track their fuel states. We track the condition of the airplanes, because periodically an airplane will have a problem airborne and we need to know when to bring him back, when not to bring him back. Maybe we have to get the others on board before we take a chance of bringing him back, so that should something happen to him, I don't have a bunch of others out there and no place to land them. People on the flight deck are all color-coded by their jerseys. And the reason for that is quick recognition. We've got probably 5 or 6 different color shirts that we put people in. For example, I wear a yellow shirt, which is kind of traditional for the air boss in the air department. But also the yellow shirts generally designate directors. These people are the ones who are more qualified. They are the ones who physically tell the pilots how to maneuver their airplanes as they're taxiing around the deck. We also have the blue shirts, who are my handlers. Those are generally my younger fellows, and they are primarily there to tie down the airplanes, to chain them down. I've got purple shirts, who are my aviation fuels people. Got white shirts, who are generally safety type individuals, monitoring safety all around the deck. Also, my corpsmen, my medical people, are in white. The aircraft troubleshooters, who are members of the squadrons, are in white. So that if an air crew calls and says, I need to see a troubleshooter, I know when one has arrived on the scene, and that way I know the airplane's getting the help he needs. We have green shirts, and those are all my catapult and arresting people. Resting gear folks are all in green shirts, and as are most of the squadron technicians. But the bottom line reason for all that is so that we can quickly identify and designate who should be where.
On the deck, crash crews in fire protective suits stand ready as firefighters and rescuers, red-clad personnel handle bombs, missiles, and other armaments. Meanwhile, the plane captains, recognizable by their brown jerseys and often seen climbing to cockpits, are responsible for the aircraft under their care. The cycle of taxiing, positioning, catapulting, recovering, maintaining, fueling, and parking aircraft aboard a carrier demands meticulous logistical coordination. In flight deck control, scaled replicas of the aircraft, marked with symbols indicating maintenance, armament, and fuel status, are positioned to mirror their real-time locations and movements on the hangar deck, flight deck, and during recovery and launch operations. The flight deck is a highly dangerous environment where high noise levels necessitate communication through clear and unmistakable hand signals. For example, daytime launch sequences are choreographed with firm, precise gestures. In the carrier's air traffic control center, controllers monitor launched flights, schedule departures, coordinate mid-air refueling, and track incoming aircraft. During landings, the flight deck officer signals clear deck or foul deck, indicating whether conditions are safe or unsafe for arrivals. When an aircraft safely lands, a green light at the runway's end confirms the deck is clear. The aircraft rolls back slightly to release the cable, and the pilot is instructed to raise the tail hook. A hook runner then signals that the cable is clear and safe for retraction. the pilot is directed to taxi away from the landing area, allowing the deck to be readied for the next landing. At night, the same process is carried out using lighted wands with personnel easily identified by reflective markings on their helmets. The rapid yet organized sequence is made possible by rigorous training and carefully monitored rehearsals, ensuring smooth and safe operations. New crew members learn their roles step by step, mastering the timing and movements required to navigate the flight deck's dangerous environment.
Well, if you get, let's say, for example, I've got 47 airplanes on the roof here, and we have a large launch of 30 or 35 of those aircraft in a very confined space, such as a flight deck. You've got a lot of jet blast, you've got a lot of heat, you've got a lot of moving parts out there on the flight deck. We have on the flight deck, on this flight deck, 4 catapults and 4 normal sets of arresting gear that we use to recover the airplanes, to stop the airplanes for the arresting gear. We have a 5th wire, if you will, that we also put up a large net associated with that. It's called a barricade. That is an emergency-only usage piece of equipment that is there should, for example, an airplane's hook break, his arresting gear hook. If it breaks while he launches or in the air, or he can't get it down, he has no other way to stop his airplane. We can then raise this barricade, which is a large 20-foot high net that goes across the landing area, and he can fly into it.
The deck is designed to withstand the impact of an aircraft approaching at 170 knots, and crew members engage in regular rehearsals for real-world scenarios, including crash, fire, and injury simulations, all aimed at honing their skills to contain potential damage. Air crews also conduct frequent practice sessions to stay current with day operations and increasingly challenging night landings.
Well, we have 4 wires on the aft portion of the ship of our arresting gear wires. Any one of them is fully as capable as the rest to stop an airplane. But the further aft that you go, the number 1 wire is the furthest aft that we have. For an airplane to catch that means that he is lower than he should be. And we would like to provide the airplane, or have him provide himself, the maximum clearance that he can over the back end of the ship before he lands and still catch a wire. So the ideal target wire, the one that he's trying to hit, is the 3 wire. And so we have varying distances, but essentially we've got about 40 feet between the wires, between each wire. So he's got a very small landing area that he's shooting for.
A pilot approaching the deck has a narrow 200-foot safe zone to land. For an F-14 with a 64-foot wingspan, the clearance between parked aircraft on either side is minimal, especially while traveling at around 135 knots. The challenge is heightened by the movement of the ship, which is constantly moving forward, rolling, and pitching. This makes landing even more demanding, requiring intense focus, quick-eyed hand coordination, and precision. Fatigue from combat missions only adds to the challenge. Lieutenant Commander Gary Tritt emphasizes the importance of reducing risks and enhancing safety for pilots and flight deck operations.
Extreme amount of concentration on the pilot. If all your systems in the aircraft are working and the ship is giving you information, automatic carrier landing system, or the ILS is up, then the pilot is at a point where he has to then put all the concentration towards that effort and to fly the aircraft down to a good start on the ball, so that as you come in for the landing from a half a mile to 3/4 in, you have the parameter set up and you're able to fly the ball all the way down without gross deviations. The biggest problem being is that if you're tired or if you have an aircraft problem and the variables with the ship itself, then you rely a lot also on the LSOs and on your RIO to be able to give you instant feedback on what you're doing.
To that end, new technologies are continually being developed. These include advanced aircraft navigational aids and sophisticated guidance systems, such as automatic throttles to maintain proper approach angles, and the F-18's fully automated hands-off recovery system, which relies on interactive radar-controlled shipboard guidance. The basic approach involves lining up with the glide path, or groove, about 3/4 of a mile out, ensuring the pilot stays on the correct glide slope by keeping the ball light centered within precise parameters. This optical glide path system uses a gyroscopically stabilized array of Fresnel lenses to project narrow beams of light, guiding the pilot along the desired path. The pilot must maintain proper alignment with the runway center and adjust the angle of attack to ensure the correct airspeed. If the pilot is too high, the ball will appear above the green reference lights, prompting the need to lower the glide path. If the pilot is too low, the ball will fall below the green lights, and the pilot must raise the glide path. If, at the final stage of the approach, the pilot is too low and the red ball appears at the bottom of the display, the landing signal officer may instruct the pilot to wave off and try the approach again. From entering the groove to touching down, the pilot has only 12 seconds, and during this brief time, the LSO must decide if a wave-off is necessary. The landing signal officers are experienced pilots who oversee the final approach and landing of aircraft on the carrier deck, ensuring safety and proper alignment. Positioned on the aft port side of the flight deck behind the windscreen, the LSOs use both visual cues and radio communication to provide real-time corrections to pilots. After each landing, the LSOs provide feedback through written comments, which are used in the pilot's debriefings.
Normally, there are 4 arresting gear wires or cross-deck pendants rigged under normal operations. We target the 3rd one. We have the ability, or the air boss in the primary has the ability to target any of the wires. We can set he can set how far down the deck he wants that pilot to touch down. And once again, though, that's only in the case of him flying an ideal glide slope. So that'll tell us, just a quick look, it tells us how far down the deck we're targeting. We normally use a 3.5-degree glide slope. We have the capability to go to 4-degree glide slope, and the air boss and the LSOs together talk about that and decide we will switch to 4-degree glide slope under high wind conditions, which is usually 35 knots or more, or extremely gusty winds. We do that, it just gives us a little more hook to ramp clearance. And if the deck's moving or the winds are gusting, it just gives us a little more margin there. Slightly steeper angle. This is known as a pickle switch, and it allows us to communicate with airplanes without transmitting on the radio, and also is our safety backup, allows us to wave off airplanes. We need to wave off airplanes for a variety of reasons. One of the big reasons is if the airplane is out of parameters to land. If he's gotten underpowered and gotten too low and is in danger of hitting the ramp of the ship, or he's lined up too far right or left to salvage the pass, the best solution is we just pull this little trigger, red wave-off lights start to flash on the optical landing system, and he knows to go to full power and go around. The other reason we may wave off an airplane is for a foul deck. A deck where the arresting gear is not set, where there are people or airplanes in the landing area. There are any number of reasons why there's something in the way that we can't land airplanes. So once again, we would just wave them off.
For operational security, especially when avoiding electronic detection, radio silence is sometimes maintained, and communications are handled using lights. The cut lights, a row of green lights atop the Fresnel lens system, signal to the pilot when they are next in line to land. These lights are controlled by the LSO using a handheld pickle switch. If the pilot needs to add power to maintain correct glide slope, the cut lights are held an extra second or two to indicate the need for more thrust. In challenging conditions, such as bad weather or nighttime operations, sophisticated equipment aids the LSO team. The heads-up display and flat screen provide a real-time centerline perspective of the aircraft's approach, allowing the LSOs to detect any drift to the right or left just before touchdown, ensuring timely corrections are made. The safety and success of carrier operations rely heavily on preparation, training, and stringent procedures. A critical aspect of these operations is the management of landing and fuel, particularly when dealing with difficult conditions like night landings, adverse weather, or low fuel situations. Night landings, night traps, are particularly challenging because of the loss of visual references. Without a visible horizon or the deck of the ship, pilots rely on their instruments and guidance from LSOs. These landings require a high level of skill, and while many pilots become proficient, they often describe their experience as having a night in the barrel, a tough night, or struggling with conditions before mastering the process.
Vertigo in flying at night is a very prominent problem. A pilot has to rely on his instincts and his training to fly the aircraft by instruments. Believe what you see and not what you feel. The biggest problem that will occur is that guys will then begin to they feel that they're in a left-hand turn, they don't believe the instrumentation that they see in front of them, and they may try to correct. Henceforth, they get themselves in a lot of trouble.
In addition to night landings, pilots must also contend with unpredictable weather, such as heavy winds, rough seas, sleet, snow, and ice. These conditions add an additional layer of difficulty to flight operations on an already slippery and challenging flight deck.
Break out, and you say, okay, you're at 3/4 of a mile, call the ball, which is a key to transition to a visual scan. And the LSOs at that point pick you up visually and start talking to you. Well, at 3/4 of a mile, he said, call the ball. I looked out, and there wasn't no ball because, in fact, I was still in the clouds. So I waited, and I'm still flying. This is about the last 15 to 20 seconds of flight. I'm waiting a number of seconds and still flying the needles down to the minimum altitude, and I still don't see anything. Finally, about the time I'm going to add power and take it around, the LSOs say paddles contact, which means they see me, even though I don't see the ship. They see my landing light. They say paddles contact, little right for lineup, little power back on. So they're giving me some call before I can see the ship. My heart's going at about 400 beats a minute, of course, at this point. And about 3, 4, 5 seconds later, I finally start to see something. I break out, which means I get clear of the clouds and see an outline of the ship, pick up the meatball, which is my saving grace there, and I make a last-minute play for the deck. I can't see any of the lineup because the snow's falling on the deck and melting and creating like a shimmering effect to where the landing area is not illuminated. But I see a couple airplanes on the left and a line of airplanes on the right and kind of go, well, this is about right. And I get it aboard, catch a 4-wire, but that was probably the toughest landing I ever had to make. Well, periodically when we're recovering airplanes, for whatever reason, an airplane does not get aboard when he should. He's not able to catch one of the wires, or the deck may not be ready. Well, fuel is obviously a critical factor in the equation.
A strict fuel management procedure is enforced to ensure aircraft can make safe landings. In many cases, a tanker aircraft is kept airborne during operations to provide refueling to aircraft that need it. If an aircraft is running low on fuel and has already made several unsuccessful landing attempts, it will be directed to the tanker for refueling. In some cases, if the aircraft is unable to make it back to the carrier, a designated bingo field, divert field, will be assigned where the aircraft can land safely. However, in remote operational areas, it may not always be possible to reach a bingo field, highlighting the importance of maintaining fuel reserves and having refueling aircraft on standby. In blue water flight operations where aircraft carriers operate far from land, the stakes are incredibly high. Once all aircraft are back on board, the landing signal officers, LSOs, play a crucial role in pilot debriefings. They visit each squadron's ready room to critique landings and overall performance. The LSOs provide detailed feedback, which is documented and presented during routine debriefings. Each pilot's performance is reflected on a greenie board, a visual display of individual grades that serves as a point of pride for the pilots. Equally impressive is the extensive work that occurs below the flight deck. The carrier's hangar bay is a bustling hub where maintenance crews work tirelessly to keep the aircraft operational. This area is spacious enough to house half the air wing, enabling efficient servicing and repairs. Aircraft are diagnosed and fixed quickly before being sent back to the flight deck via one of the 4 elevators. The work is relentless, with personnel operating around the clock, 12, 16, or even 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. Directly beneath the catapult, highly trained personnel adjust the steam catapults to the precise pressure needed for each type of aircraft based on its weight. Similarly, operators for the arresting gear set the tension on the arresting wires, carefully calibrated to match the speed and weight of the incoming aircraft. The entire operation of the carrier battle group relies on this concentrated attention to detail, a commitment to safety, and the integration of human skill with advanced technology. This level of dedication ensures that the carrier can perform its critical mission effectively and efficiently, whether in peacetime operations or during combat scenarios. A carrier mission begins well before aircraft takeoff, with each squadron conducting air wing briefings in their respective ready rooms about 2 hours prior to launch. The extensive preparation process involves several critical tasks that come together for the mission's success. The purple shirts, also called grapes, who are responsible for refueling the aircraft, will have completed fueling operations. Meanwhile, the ordnance teams work to deliver, attach, and arm the weapons that the aircraft will carry on the mission. The plane captains, dressed in blue shirts, ensure that each aircraft undergoes a thorough final inspection and pre-flight check. Once the aircraft are ready, the air crews strap in for their respective missions, and the rescue helicopter is the first to take off. It remains airborne to provide immediate support in case of an emergency. With the deck clear for launch, the flight deck crew initiates the next phase. The takeoff weight of each aircraft is displayed to both the pilot and the CAT officer for verification. The catapult officer adjusts the steam pressure accordingly to match the aircraft's weight. The catapult system plays a critical role in the launch sequence. Aircraft are carefully positioned on the catapult, with the launch bar engaged into the catapult shuttle. As the required steam pressure is reached, the system is primed to launch, with the retaining link snapped off, propelling the aircraft forward at launch speed. The speed of this entire sequence is vital. An aircraft must be launched every 90 seconds from the same catapult to maintain operational efficiency. Each step of this process requires precise coordination and timing to ensure that the air wing can take off swiftly and safely, ready to carry out its mission. Once an aircraft is launched, the deck is immediately re-prepared to recover the returning aircraft. The recovery process is just as crucial and demanding. When an aircraft approaches for landing, it enters what is called the groove, an alignment point where the pilot's approach is monitored by the landing signal officer, LSO. The pilot then checks in with the LSO, calling out his status, including his fuel weight, and preparing for the landing. The arresting wire tension is adjusted based on the aircraft's weight and speed, and once the aircraft is successfully caught by one of the arresting wires, it is trapped. The recovery is a precise maneuver, and this entire process is carried out in intervals as short as 45 seconds. With a constant rhythm of launching and landing, the crew makes it look easy, though the reality is far from simple. The air crews are quick to credit the flight deck crew, recognizing that their role is just as, if not more, dangerous than flying. As one bombardier navigator puts it, while the air crews depart, the flight deck crew remains on the deck in all conditions, from extreme weather to high-stress operations, working tirelessly 18 hours a day. Their ability to maintain this pace is the backbone of the carrier's mission, and without them, the aircraft wouldn't be able to operate as effectively.
Coming home from a 6-month deployment is always a pleasure. But at the same time, you look back on what you've done, what the mission was, and I think almost to a man on board the carrier, you recognize that we've done what we had to do. We're not warmongers. We're not out there to start wars or anything, but we're there to be a presence, to be a force, and should we be called upon to be ready. And I think we were, and I think that's the tremendous advantage that this Navy has.
The efforts of the flight deck crew and the air wing personnel truly come to fruition during intense operational missions such as those seen during the Gulf War. Carrier-based Navy fighter and attack aircraft played a significant role, flying over 26,000 sorties, which accounted for nearly a quarter of all air missions in the war. Lieutenant General Chuck Corners, the commander of Desert Storm Air Forces, noted,
The United States Navy provided 6 carriers to fight this battle, and that's a lot of firepower. The other thing that was unique is as the war shifted from across the entire country of Iraq into the Kuwaiti theater in February, we were able to reposition one of the carriers from the Red Sea over to the Arabian Gulf. It's tough in carrier operations because you have to take into account, landing, repositioning on the deck. But they did a great job, and I'm very pleased with the way they contributed so much.
These 6 carriers formed a formidable arc around the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, providing almost 500 combat aircraft for the operation. The F-14 Tomcats, always vigilant, maintained a constant presence overhead, ensuring the fleet's protection. Meanwhile, the strike aircraft, including the A-6 Intruders and the newly introduced FA-18 Hornets, carried out crucial attacks on Iraqi ground targets, including SAM sites, and the Iraqi Navy. The FA-18 Hornet demonstrated its versatility by becoming the only Navy aircraft to shoot down an Iraqi MiG during the conflict. On one mission, it was tasked with delivering 4,000 pounds of bombs on a ground target, but the Hornet was forced to switch modes. Just 15 miles from its target, it switched to fighter mode, shot down the MiG with air-to-air missiles, and then completed its original bombing run, showcasing the multi-mission capability of the aircraft. This efficient and adaptive combat readiness highlights the strength and effectiveness of the carrier battle group. The flight deck is the heart of this operation, and the ability to mobilize and project power anywhere in the world is its defining strength. The combination of aircraft versatility, rapid launch and recovery cycles, and coordinated support efforts underscores the unmatched power and mobility of modern carrier-based operations. This capacity for rapid deployment and sustained combat presence is a defining feature of the U.S. Navy, and it remains a cornerstone of American military strength across the globe.
The giant carriers of the United States Navy are probably the most powerful machines of war ever created. With its planes deployed, a carrier can dominate an enormous area. There are millions of parts to the machine, and the sum of these parts is a hybrid, capable of dominating both the air and the sea, and able to extend that domination over land. The aircraft carrier is, today, the most important surface ship of the fleet. 80 years ago, the carrier was a set of problems for the naval architect, and the subject of discussion for only the most advanced and imaginative of naval theorists. Its rise has been meteoric. Even at the outbreak of World War II, many naval men felt that aviation was only an aid to the battleships, which was still widely regarded as the business end of naval force. Just 5 years later, the battleship had been made obsolete. World War II established the aircraft carrier at the head of the fleet, and the images of carrier war are, for many, the most familiar and evocative records of the conflict. The result of the Pacific War was largely determined by the battles between the Japanese and American carrier forces. Once the Japanese had been stripped of their naval air power, the island-hopping might of the Allies was irresistible, and the outcome, no matter how bitterly contested, was unavoidable. While on land, the aeroplane and tank destroyed old concepts of warfare. At sea, the carriers had completely changed the scale and nature of naval engagement. The battleship's mighty guns had extended the arm of the fleet, but the carrier's mobile artillery could deliver torpedoes and bombs at far greater range. The only real threat to a carrier far at sea was the planes of another carrier. By war's end, the United States had built up a large fleet of carriers of all sizes, designed to fill all the needs for naval air support and attack. At times, groups of carriers were formed capable of mounting 1,000-plane raids while still maintaining fleet defense. Victory surely owed much to the flat tops. When these shots of United States ironclads were filmed in 1900, even the battleship was a relative newcomer, emerging from the international rivalries of the 1890s. The famous dreadnought herself dates only from 1904, by which time the aeroplane had arrived. The speed of the aeroplane's development is a signature of this remarkable century of technology. In 1903, aeroplanes barely flew. In 1914, they were advanced enough to be useful in war, and by 1918, they were unrecognizably advanced. On January the 26th, 1911, Glenn Curtiss made the first flight in a seaplane, and the Navy, an uncertain onlooker in aviation's development, began to take more serious interest in the aeroplane. Already, in December 1910, Lieutenant Theodore Ellison, the Navy's first pupil pilot, had commenced studying with Curtiss, and the Navy obtained its first aircraft in the following year. The most valuable early development was the growth of a group of flyers within the Navy who were enthusiastic proponents of the aeroplane and imaginative and serious students of its potential. Down the line, when it needed them, the Navy was equipped with experienced and dedicated aviators, capable of making the informed decisions needed in the development of naval aviation. In 1914, Europe plunged into the calamity of war. But no longer was warfare a matter of a small battlefield where armies clashed and victory was decided relatively quickly. Static fronts, dominated by artillery and machine guns, saw the opponents trapped in a process of attrition. In a contest where flesh and blood was thrown at steel bullets and shells, flesh and blood could not be expected to prevail. Above the tormented infantry, aeroplanes developed from simply being the eyes of the artillery and the generals. With their arming, they required a reappraisal, both as a potential threat and a potential tool. In the war against the submarine, they achieved their first real naval significance, and the first naval aviation activity after America's entry into the war was anti-submarine patrol.
I'll never forget one of the first flights I took out of Montauk. With one off the throne, I flew to Martha's Vineyard on a search for submarines. I had no bombs with which to attack them if I saw them, but I didn't see any anyway.
Captain Sugden's remarks underline the rudimentary state of the United States' readiness for war. Without radio to report sightings of submarines or weapons to attack them, the early patrols were almost pointless. Germany's subs created havoc among the shipping vital to the Allied war effort, and the battle to suppress them was fought with desperate urgency. The war against the submarine was to be greatly affected by the aeroplane, and by war's end, patrol aircraft, armed with depth charges and escorted by fighter planes, were a real threat to any submarine they came across. The sophistication of American aircraft was greatly increased by the alliance with the British. They had been making rapid technical advances in the seesaw battle for superior technology in the air war both over land and sea. In the defense of her vulnerable sea approaches, where the shipping congregated to enter port, Britain had developed planes with respectable endurance and weapons, and had made life increasingly difficult for the prowling German U-boats. At America's entry into the conflict, the mass production of British-designed planes formed the basis for the later emergence of the American aviation industry.
After the war had started in Europe, the British made rapid progress in flying boats for anti-submarine work, and we benefited from a knowledge gained from their experience. And by the time we were in the war, we were building at the Curtiss Company the H-16 and later the F-5 flying boats, of which thousands were built in this country and shipped abroad as anti-submarine patrol craft.
The US Navy's use of aircraft expanded rapidly, and the demand for aircraft was limited only by the availability of pilots to fly them. Many of the Navy's pilots were sent to Europe, and there was a great effort to train new flyers, selected from the abundant volunteers. Meanwhile, the developments went on, almost daily expanding the aeroplane's capability and versatility. The Royal Navy now had enough certainty about the aeroplane to see it as an essential element of future naval conflict, and was investing a huge effort into research. As in general aviation, the Navy's aeroplanes blossomed rapidly. With them grew the realization of the need for fleets to carry their planes with them, outside the protection of shore-based aircraft. The years of war, many steps were taken which were to be of great long-term value. For example, naval considerations of space, originally with the seaplane tender in mind, led to the development of folding wings. These were subsequently to be rediscovered and become essential to the operations of the modern aircraft carrier. The first American servicemen into action in the European theatre were naval pilots, flying French and British aircraft on anti-submarine patrol work from bases along the French coast. The arriving American infantry would not have known, but the protective planes in their allies' roundels, which escorted them over the last part of their hazardous transatlantic inactive service.
Well, like outside Bordeaux, a place called Lujic was being established by the Navy at that time, which was to act as a pilot school. Our group was split up there. I was assigned to the U.S. Naval Air Station with Croisic, French, which at that time was operated by the French Navy. When we arrived there, Lieutenant Commander William Corey, United States Navy, was in command, and our operation from that station consists of escorting the troop ships from the United States and the Sarah's Air convoys. We flew the French Terrier seaplane, and the patrols were long and tedious and very active.
By now, the Americans were flying planes that were armed with bombs, but still rudimentary in other respects, like the carriage of homing pigeons to dispatch messages in flight. However, even without sightings or sinkings, the patrols did curtail submarine activity.
We didn't see any submarine, but we understand after months of operation from our commanding officer that the sinkings within our area were greatly reduced.
Naval aviation was now set to make its next great step, the deployment of planes from ships. The first successful takeoff from a ship had been made by a civilian pilot, Eugene Ely, used by the U.S. Navy in trials conducted aboard the USS Birmingham. He flew his plane from a specially constructed ramp over the ship's bow. This had taken place as early as the 14th of November 1910, but though the Navy was fascinated by the event, it was unable to develop it operationally. During the war, however, there was such a great need for aircraft to attend and reconnoiter for the fleet that attention was focused on the problem. Much of the testing was devoted to the seaplane, which would be able to land beside its tender for recovery. For launching planes, experiments were conducted with catapults, and the US was to invest considerable energy and ingenuity in systems for seaplane development from battleships and cruisers, right up to the Second World War. However, the seaplanes were slow and heavy. It was obviously preferable to be able to deploy faster wheeled land planes, particularly if their role was in part to fend off attacking aircraft. By the war's end, naval aviation had developed a long way in the sophistication, speed, reliability, endurance, and weaponry of the planes, and in the means of deployment. In contrast to Captain Sugden's unarmed submarine patrol early in the war, by the last stages of the conflict, the planes were definite threats to the U-boats.
My job at Dunkirk was flying fighter cover to protect the anti-submarine patrol planes. One morning on a patrol, I was in the formation of 3 onreos at about 3,000 feet, with the patrol plane at about 500 feet. It was very hazy. Suddenly, I saw a submarine below us, and the first thing I noticed was that they were firing at the patrol plane, and the bursts were coming uncomfortably close. In fact, they forced him to turn and run. However, they hadn't seen the onreos, and we were in a dive with our machine guns open, and I believe that we shot some of the gun crew off the deck. As we were closing on the submarine, it started to submerge. And at that point, the patrol plane turned around and came back and dropped 2 depth charges on the spot. We circled, and in about a minute, the submarine came up bow first at an extreme angle, and then sunk back again stern first. We received official credit for a submarine on this patrol.
The 4 years of Europe's war dragged to a conclusion. Both sides were exhausted, bled of their manpower, and scarred by the brutality of the conflict. The legacies of the war were to be instability, extremism, and ultimately another war. The carnage led many to pacifist idealism, and there were to be repeated attempts to install a peaceful regime in world affairs. For the armistice, there was universal heartfelt relief and joy that the killing had stopped, at least for the moment, hopefully forever. For the US Navy, the peace brought massive immediate budget cuts and left only a kernel of the great organization that had been constructed. But this was a critical time for the Navy. Many lessons had been learnt, and these had to be digested and their implications pursued. The Navy contained an enormous spread of opinion about planes and their importance, and it was to be a debate that was fought long and hard. It was difficult for many admirals to believe that a swarm of gnats could threaten their battleships, built to withstand the fire of other battleships. The Navy's strength was in its guns, and the battleships of the fleet were not symbolic of its power, they were its power. The battle line retained its strategic supremacy. Also unchanged, despite spirited argument and demonstration from the air arm, was the broadly held understanding of naval tactics and the subsidiary roles allocated to the other naval units. In 1919, the Navy was given permission to convert the fleet collier Jupiter into an experimental carrier and renamed her Langley, after Professor S.P. Langley, a pioneer aviation theorist.
So this is the photograph of the Langley when she was finally, as she was when she was finally converted. The conversion was authorized in 1919, but she wasn't commissioned until 1922. The ship was stripped down to its main deck, and then this superstructure put in there, built in like a railroad bridge. We had many things we had to work out. Since she was an experimental carrier, the forerunner of the Saratoga, like many, many things. There's not only the resting gear, the catapult.
In those battleship-obsessed times, there were a number of far-sighted Navy men who could see the writing on the wall. By the time of the Langley's commissioning in 1922, there was plenty of evidence to influence them. British experience with the Furious had impressed the Navy sufficiently for it to have vigorously pushed for the construction of 4 large, fast carriers. However, in hindsight, these would have been very strange ships indeed. They were designed with heavy surface armament, twin superstructures, and several other idiosyncrasies that would have made them into white elephants. They were rejected, not for their design deficiencies, but because of budgetary restrictions. Congress allowed only the money for the Langley's conversion. The politicians had accidentally made the right decision, and the Langley was to repay them handsomely, as she was to be an outstandingly successful laboratory and incubator for American naval air power. The Langley tried and tested methods that stood the Navy in good stead. With the experience gained on her decks, by the time the Navy secured funds for its next carriers, most of the misconceptions had been abandoned. Despite being based on battlecruiser hulls and the rather ridiculous inclusion of 8-inch gun batteries, the Lexington and Saratoga were to be successful carriers. Naval thinking about aircraft still revolved around battleships. The planes could supplement the cruiser lines and destroyer sweeps to reconnoiter for the fleet and locate enemy units. They could then keep an eye on the targets and guide the battle fleet into range. And then it would be over to the big guns, and the last role for the plane would be as an artillery spotter, advising fall of shot and directing the gunnery onto the victim. In the years of peace, it would remain the task of the aviators to convince those around them that far from being the spotter for the battleship's artillery, the aeroplane itself would, in the future, be the artillery. The Langley was slow, small, and limited, but she, and not the proud battle line, was the face of the future. In 1920, the battleship was still the power of the fleet. Studies of the trajectories of incoming shells had given her armored decks, and the invention of the torpedo and submarine had given her a belt of armor around her waterline. If, as the enthusiasts of aviation asserted, the aeroplane was a real threat, then obviously the versatile battleship would adapt to nullify that threat. The carrier was really only a side issue. The main debate was between the proponents of plane and battleship. One area where the two sides agreed was that there was a need to assess the situation practically, rather than in endless hostile theorizing. And so, in 1921, while the Langley was still under reconstruction, a series of trials were conducted to sink warships from the air.
The Navy wanted to count bombing tests against naval vessels, but was hampered because of a lack of adequate targets. Fortunately, at the end of the First World War, when Germany surrendered its ships, they were apportioned among the Allied naval powers. When the ships arrived, it formed a naval task force composed of Navy, aircraft, and Marine planes, and I was put in charge. The Navy invited the Army to take part in the tests, feeling that we all had a lot to learn about bombing ships, and all of our pilots should get experience in that work. The plan called for bombing one ship of each type: submarine, destroyer, cruiser, and battleship. And to attack all the ships, first with small bombs, and then work up gradually to bigger and bigger bombs. To inspect the ships after each attack, and to have the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps planes the attack. That, of course, was the bombing of the battleship Ostfriesland.
The Ostfriesland, of 22,000 tons, was still a fairly modern ship. Built in 1911, before the days of air attack, she was, nonetheless, constructed to withstand heavy bombardment, and the Germans had a well-deserved reputation for the quality of their armor, so she was seen as a serious test of the aeroplane's power. Waves of aircraft bombed her over a day and a half. She was hit repeatedly and extensively damaged, but remained seaworthy. Though she was a stationary target, few of the bombs dropped actually hit her, and she suffered major damage only when she was struck by a 2,000-pound bomb, the biggest available. Even then, she took hours to sink. Had she been given reasonable damage control and fire parties, she would have stayed afloat.
The next morning, the newspapers carried big accounts of the whole thing and created the impression throughout the country that aviation had made navies obsolete.
Though the aviation enthusiasts claimed a clear victory, fairer assessments were not so clear-cut. If the battleship had to adapt, then equally, the aeroplane still had a long way to go. Tests continued throughout the interwar years, seeing a series of old US battleships meeting the same messy and undignified scuttling. Meanwhile, within the Navy, aviation had secured some effective and forceful advocates, including the Chief of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, Admiral William A. Moffett.
Admiral Moffett has generally been called the father of naval aviation, and I think very properly so, because he is probably responsible more than any other one man for our having a single Navy, a single weapon system, making use of aviation as an integral part of the Navy, if not its main striking power. That was Admiral Moffett's accomplishment. He was a very attractive, forceful, and energetic man with a tremendous power of persuasion. And being a very brainy man, he tied in persuasion with logic. So he was able to put his ideas across both to the public and to the Navy itself.
Admiral Moffett died in the crash of one of the Navy's airships, but he'd overseen the Navy's thinking on aviation well, and his work in establishing an effective structure for naval aviation, staffed by dedicated and like-minded officers, meant that not only did he leave a clear course for development, but the men to see it followed. Naval aviation encompassed three major areas of operation. There were numerous patrol aircraft. These were large, long-range flying boats or ship-based seaplanes, charged with control of the sea lanes, reconnaissance, and active submarine attack, normally operating independently. Though effective at their jobs, they were not to be expected to dogfight their way in hostile airspace, being agonizingly slow and hard to defend. Even slower were the Navy's giant rigid airships, the ultimate in airborne observation platforms and capable of huge lifting, theoretically a highly effective anti-sub patrol or convoy escort. With ship-based mooring mast, the airships could travel with and aid the fleet, but history was to overtake them before the next war. The Navy also had numerous other smaller non-rigids, which performed their jobs very well, but a lot of glamour was invested in the airships, as well as a large amount of the scarce funds for naval aviation. Until 1927, the sole representative of the Navy's third air arm, carriers, was the little Langley. Though she was small, she saw the Navy's future leaders pass, and their experience in making a workable aerodrome out of her pocket handkerchief flight deck was to be the long-serving basis of carrier practice. Those who flew with the Langley retained a certain distinction within the Navy for many years. However, despite the Langley's small deck, and even with the limited pilot training of the day, the difficulty of working from the ship was more apparent than real. The planes themselves were so slow, stable and controllable that operations were more reliant upon nerve and skill than on luck.
The qualification consisted of 3 successful landings and takeoffs. And once you'd made 3 of them, you were a carrier pilot. And of course, we built this thing up. Those of us who were carrier pilots, we affected to look down our nose at all other aviators because we were Langley pilots. And we built this all up to be quite a thing. And then later, when we got the other carriers, and it was our job to train and classify other carriers, then we had to break it all down again and convince everybody it was easy and safe and nothing to it. But that Langley was really something.
Various configurations and ideas were tried out in the quest for the most effective way of landing planes safely onto the narrow deck. This experimentation, of course, also included study of the aircraft and their ability to withstand the stresses of the often direct and severe shipboard landings. Transverse arrestor wires and fore and aft wires to prevent the plane from slewing over the side were used on the Langley individually and in combination. As part of the process of operational evolution, the arrestor hook, symbolic of the carrier aircraft, was developed and refined.
One of my jobs was to design the hook, the trailing hook that engaged the wires that were attached to the airplane. We had a very vague idea of what the stresses actually were on the airplane, if they were important to have in order to design the hook and its attachments, and also to know the distribution of the weights in the hole. So I borrowed from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics an accelerometer. It was the only one in existence. It was their pride and joy. And I faithfully promised that I'd take good care of it. The film that made the record, the accelerometer, was only good for 30 seconds. So it had to be turned on just as the airplane was coming over the ramp and the pilot was concentrating on making a precision landing. So I got in this B-7 and circled around and came in for my landing. Just as I came over the ramp, I put my head in the cockpit to turn the switch on. Well, I must have unconsciously pushed the stick forward, because when I put my head out of that cockpit, that deck was coming up here 100 miles an hour. I was too low and too fast. I pulled back, but it was too late. My hook engaged the cross wire, but my actual hooks didn't engage the fore and aft wire. I had the dubious distinction of being the first man to go overboard on any of our aircraft carriers. it was the most embarrassing incident that I remember in my whole career, because I designed the hook that broke. I was flying the airplane that broke the hook. And I crashed an airplane, and I lost the NACA's accelerometer.
Admiral Pennoyer may have been the first to go over the side, but naval aviators were to discover many ways of getting into trouble during carrier operations and reward naval film crews with some prize crash footage. Future Admiral Gerald Bergan was one of the pilots filmed in the act of crashing during a landing on the Langley.
My tail hook, as it sometimes would happen, instead of engaging the arresting wire, rode one of these fore and aft wires, which caused the plane to slew to the left. There were several people, including Commodore Reeves, standing in the gallery near the two smokestacks on the port side, and I was afraid that my propeller would chew them up. So against all regulations, I gave her full throttle, and I did a very beautiful wing.
Flying the airplanes on or off the carrier deck seemed quite an experience to us in those days, partly because of the rather low-power Hispano-Suizer engine and wooden propeller with which the airplane was equipped, and partly because of the configuration of the airplane itself. I remember we had to put 2 or 3 cushions into the cockpit seat in order to sit high enough to see over the rather sizable radiator which the liquid-cooled engine installation required. Also, the engine was rather sensitive to temperature changes, and whenever you varied the throttle up or down, you had also to vary the radiator shutters, which were manually operated. You felt a little like an organ player as you came in for a landing perched up on those cushions. One hand on the control column and one hand playing a tune, first on the throttle and then on the radiator shutters, then on the hook release, and then back to the throttle and other odds and ends, so that all this time while you are making an approach with your wheels only a few feet above the water. What the Navy needed for this situation was a whole new deal in airplane engine design, something which would make full use of the opportunities which the aircraft carrier offered, and yet be capable of the short takeoffs and landings required, and rugged enough to stand the beating of day-by-day operations into the arresting gear and by catapult shot. A new type power plant was also a key element in this program.
The development of the air-cooled radial engine was to revolutionize naval aviation, cutting weight, troublesome maintenance, and storage problems. Their weight savings made the use of catapults redundant until the post-war appearance of jet-powered planes. However, in the 1920s, the major problems for the Navy were not concerned with carrier aviation. A combination of naval treaties and funding constraints was suffocating the service. The Washington Naval Conference Accords of 1922 were designed to head off the ominous and cripplingly expensive battleship building competition developing among the major naval powers, and strict limits on building were agreed to. However, because the previous frenzy of construction meant that there were half-completed ships on all the nations in 1927. Compared to the Langley, the 2 ships were huge. they could carry and service up to 80 aeroplanes. Though there were flaws in their design, like the 8-inch gun turrets, the Lexington and Saratoga were fast, effective carriers with huge capability in defense and attack, and America was to be very glad of their services in the dark months after Pearl Harbor. By this time, the Navy had fully accepted the role of aeroplanes in the fleet, a point underlined by the Secretary of the Navy. The aerial complement of the ships broke up into fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. In addition, a couple of seaplane patrol aircraft were carried, which could be lifted out onto the water by crane or catapulted from the deck. But in the longer term, they became irrelevant. The carrier crews had their attention focused on the flat top's potential to act as an attack weapon. What the air crews practiced and thought about was offensive action. To better use their bombs, they invented the dive bombing technique, which was to be their most successful attack method. The result of the effort and experimentation of the carrier crews and their airmen was a working system. Through experimentation and refinement, the process of development was to continue unabated. But after the Langley, the two big new carriers started life as very effective machines from the first time they flew their aircraft aboard. In part, this was an accident of their birth as battlecruisers. The Navy was to show a leaning towards smaller ships, and Lexington and Saratoga were to remain the largest carriers up until the post-war Midway class. They had been built to the virtually unchanged cruiser hulls, with a massive hangar 450 feet long, 70 feet wide, installed on top. There was a further maintenance shop, and below was a hold for storing spare aircraft. This gave a massive firepower through the big ship's many planes. To spare the fleet from having to follow the carrier's antics as she prowled round the wind to fly her planes off, she and her defensive screen and support ships were made into a separate unit. However, rather than having the forlorn look of an urchin set aside from the center of activity, the arrangement immediately suggested an active intent, an attacking formation. The carrier task force had been born. Where the Navy had obtained only 3 aircraft carriers, none of which had been originally laid down as such, it had dozens of types of aircraft. Most of these were designed specifically for operating in the harsh shipboard environment. The majority of types tested and used were in circulation for only a short time. Small orders and high attrition through crashes and mechanical failure over the sea saw the types rotated into and out of service regularly. Some manufacturers chose to specialize in the construction of Navy planes, and their designers became expert in the special considerations of carriers. The small production runs hampered the rapid growth of these firms, but they were, with bankruptcies and collapse widespread in aviation, happy to still be in business, and happier still to continue refinement of their design ideas. Steadily, the Navy's aircraft improved, and the carrier men delighted in the responsiveness and agility of their biplanes as they went about the serious business of practicing combat and attack tactics.
In those days, it wasn't, as I say, we were, to some degree, kind of pampered pets, prima donnas. We were developing dive bombing techniques. We were developing formation and tactical technique. We had a pretty free hand. Was it established fleet aviation as a real combat arm of the fleet? And I never had so much fun in my life.
At what point were you pretty certain that you were going to Southeast Asia, that you were going to a real fight?
As soon as I saw orders to F-4 Phantoms, I knew that, and particularly since I was going to the West Coast, we knew that we would be taking part in the Vietnam conflict. it wasn't a popular war. Those of us that lived through it at that period of time knew that the country was somewhat torn apart by it, and it wasn't popular here in the U.S., but I had signed on to be a naval officer. And when you sign on to be a naval officer, you're going to receive orders and you will follow those orders. And so it was something that I knew would most likely occur, although you kept thinking, well, gee, maybe this war will be over soon. Maybe it'll be over right away.
Yeah.
So I wasn't necessarily going after it because I would get to fly in combat, although that was a very challenging form of flying and would develop you in many, many ways as a pilot, as an aviator. But I knew there was a good chance that I'd wind up in Vietnam, and sure enough, I did.
I think you said it was in troop support in South Vietnam, so you weren't really expecting air defense problems or MiG problems. What do you remember about how that mission turned out, or what was accomplished?
Well, that was, of course, my first combat mission, and the airplane that I flew on that one was interesting because that was F-4B, bureau number 153019, side number 201, so that's the skipper's airplane. In each squadron, the 00 side number would be the air wing commander's airplane. So that would have the wing commander's name on it. 201 was the commanding officer of the squadron's airplane. 202 was the executive officer. 203 would be the operations officer, and so on. And side number 201, 153019, had been our airplane that shot down a MiG-17 on something like March 6th or 8th of 1972. And so that happened to be the airplane that I drew for my very first combat sortie, and it was troops in contact in South Vietnam, and can we help them with some close air support? And I remember I got to fly, when you're a new guy, you're going to fly with the more senior RIOs, radar intercept officers, the backseaters. You're going to fly with a more senior RIO. So I flew with Wingo Simonson was his name. And Wingo, we affectionately called him Black Cloud because it seemed like if somebody was getting shot at, it was him. And so I drew him for my first mission, and I rolled in on my first bomb run, and I don't know what he saw. It looked fine to me, but he said, no, abort, you're not lined up. Well, I've got the gun sight, so I mean, I could see the bomb sight. I could see where I was aimed at. But anyway, I remember he made me go around again and come back, which wasn't really a big thing, I suppose, in South Vietnam, where you didn't have quite the threat that you had in North Vietnam. You didn't make multiple runs in North Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I do remember that. And so that had been my first mission. Came back to the carrier, and I was at the wrong altitude when I rolled out in the groove, and I thought I had the ball on the optic lens that we use to judge your glide slope when you're coming back in, but I didn't. It turned out I had a false ball that I saw in the mirror, and so I was too low. And the landing signal officer, I remember, said, come on, put it up in the middle where it's supposed to be. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, I must not. And so I brought it up, and sure enough, there's the ball. So I got a crummy grade for my very first carrier landing in the squadron. And the grades that you could get was okay, and these are like grades in college. That was a 4.0. A fair was 3.0. A no grade was what I got. That was a 2.0. A wave off is even worse. That's a 1.0, or a really bad pass. And then below, let's see, wave off, there was a pass that was called cut, C-U-T, cut, a cut pass. I only ever saw one of those happen. It wasn't me, fortunately. But anyway, so I remember all that from that very first mission.
I was just wondering how many people could quickly come up with their own N number, and you're remembering these every airplane you flew. by the numbers. It's amazing.
Well, that particular one in particular, because it was our squadron's MiG killer. And in fact, it's out there where it can be seen on a pole. And my wife tells me that's called, when you put a jet airplane on a pole, now it becomes a jetsicle, is what she refers to it as. That airplane is on the pole at Key West Naval Air Station, down on Key West. And so it's on the pole. So 153019201, our MiG killer, is down there.
Have you been down to see it?
I haven't. No, I haven't been down there.
If you just think about the Vietnam experience in kind of totality, if there's any particular missions that you would like to mention or that stood out for you, and then just kind of, if it was a Rorschach test and I said Southeast Asia, just sort of your impression of the whole duty you did over there.
I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way, because I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And so that's something that I guess is pretty apparent to you. And I was 25 years old at that time. And I have a 26-year-old daughter now, and she is really amazed by the fact that I was flying combat missions and being shot at, flying over Hanoi and Haiphong and Vinh and Thanh Hoa and all of those places over there when I was just 25 years old. And one of the things I'll never forget was when we came home. It's another dad story. But when we flew home, we launched off all the flyable airplanes when we get about 300 miles off the California coast. And then we'd fly to California, coasted in at Big Sur, and then flew down California to arrive back in San Diego at Miramar. And I'll never forget, my dad was standing, I got out of the airplane, somebody handed me a bottle of champagne because we're home safe and alive. And my dad snapped a photo of me standing by my Phantom with that bottle of champagne, and then he walked up to me and he gave me a big hug and he said, "You will never know how for the last 6 months I wished I had never taught you how to fly."
Oh my.
Another one of those moments about my dad that I just won't ever forget. So I was fairly apprehensive, I guess. Now we're, as humans, we're usually pretty good at covering up our feelings and not letting it bother us too much, but I guess we're just adjusting and adapting to the situation, because I remember on that flight, I mentioned that we launched about 300 miles off the coast. I had a really crummy Phantom that it was flyable, but it didn't have much in the way of anything else. It didn't have a working radio. It didn't have a working TACAN, which is like VORDME. I didn't have navigation, so I was flying on another Phantom's wing, and he was doing all the navigating and all the talking. And when we got to Miramar, we came into the break, and he put me on the left side, so that then when we got overhead the runway, he kissed me off, which means, okay, brake, come around and land, taxi clear of the runway, and then wait for him, and he'll lead me back in, because I can't call ground control, obviously, or tower. And so flying towards California, I can't see anything but ocean and clouds and haze and all that kind of stuff. And then I caught my first glimpse of land, and I'll never forget. I remember I felt this cold shot in my heart. And then I said, "Oh, wait, that's California." So I think that was happening to me every time I launched off the carrier and had a combat mission, because we were quite a ways offshore, 50 miles offshore. And when you first caught sight of land on your way in on a combat mission, I guess you had kind of a tense moment.
Now it starts.
And then now it starts.
Your home was on the water.
Yes. And I'll never forget when I first saw land, because I don't have navigation. I can't tell how close we are or anything like that. But when I saw California, it was, oh, no, it's okay. That's California.
Have you been back to Southeast Asia for any reason since you did a tour over there?
Yes. I was a speaker on a cruise ship that went to Vietnam. And it was 40 years later, so that was 2012, that I was back there. And, it's heartwarming to see that they don't hate us. They don't hate us over there. Of course, it's referred to over there as the American War. We call it the Vietnam War. They call it the American War. 80% of the population was born after the end of the war. So they have adjusted, they've adapted, they have succeeded financially in a huge way. They have recovered very greatly from it, and they don't resent us, and that was nice to see.
Were there any other particular missions that? I meant to say, somewhere in one of your cruises, you went to Miramar to Top Gun. How did that come about?
Top Gun was really a thrill. And that happened after my first cruise. So I was a relatively junior fighter pilot. I just had half a cruise, and there were, much more senior guys than me in the squadron. But I mentioned Jim Rulifson earlier. He had been one of the founders of Top Gun. They put together a cadre of pilots and Rios, backseaters, that were the best of the best, and they formed up the Top Gun school. Well, he had been one of the founders of it, and now he's our operations officer, and he picked me to go to Top Gun out of that squadron. So I must have done well in actual combat, because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. I was not a full lieutenant in the Navy, which would be a captain in the Air Force. Top Gun actually had a guideline that says, we will not take a lieutenant junior grade pilot because he isn't experienced enough or advanced enough. But because Jim Rulifson had been one of the founders and he sent me to Top Gun, they let me come to the school. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun.
Wow.
And it was
clearly overlooked your no grade.
It was, yeah.
First mission.
I was forgiven for that no grade. I had a whole lot better carrier landing grades later on, but that first one was not a good start. But I surprised everyone on my first night landing. And of course, what they did is they made sure you got a number of daytime landings, and then it was going to be time for them to send you out at night. And so when it was time for you to come back in the dark, they'd bring up the camera, the TV in the ready room that lets you watch the landing approaches. And everyone in the squadron would be crowded around to see how that was going. And I had a pretty darn good pass. And so I was pretty much centered up. There was another pilot that had joined the squadron right at the same time I did. He had a terrible night. He got waved off twice in a row. And then on the third attempt, he got waved off again. But on the go-around, he over-rotated. And when you over-rotate, on a wave off, you had to not rotate at all. You just added the power up and don't pull the nose up. Well, he pulled the nose up. What does that do? It drops the hook down lower. He got what's called an in-flight engagement. His hook grabbed a cable, slammed that airplane down on the carrier deck. So he had a really, really bad start on his night grades because he had 2 wave offs and then a cut pass for his trap when he actually got aboard. So my no grade, I guess, looked pretty good compared to all of that.
Did you ever ask why you were chosen as such a junior guy for Top Gun, or did you have that discussion?
I never did. I never did. And I had not known about that guideline that they had where they said, we will not take a lieutenant junior grade pilot. I didn't know anything about it. It wasn't until years later that I found that out. I should ask Jim Rulifson about it. He's still around. He's on the East Coast. But he picked me for Top Gun, and because he was the one that picked me, they let me come to the class. And that was sure interesting. However, there was nobody that looked anything like Kelly McGillis there.
That's where I was going to go next. Everybody that's seen the movie thinks they know what Top Gun is like, and I'll bet you're going to tell us something different.
Oh, golly, yes. It was quite a bit different. Some of it was similar to what they showed in the movie. But there were, back in those days, we're talking 1972, the women were not as integrated into everything as they are nowadays, of course. So I don't believe there were any women at all at Top Gun. Even our young sailors, we had female waves that did a lot of things in the Navy. I don't even remember seeing any of those there, but it was fascinating. And my very first dogfight was against the Navy's MiG ace, Duke Cunningham. He had just come back. From Vietnam right about the same time my carrier did. He was on the Constellation, and of course he had just become the first MiG ace of the Vietnam War. He and Willie Driscoll in the back seat. He had just finished his instructor qualification to be a Top Gun teacher, and he was flying one of the we called it the Mongoose. He was flying the A4 Skyhawk, where they had boarded up the wing slats because those could cause asymmetries when you're pulling a lot of G's. They had boarded those up. They had stripped all the weight they could out of the airplane. They put a bigger engine in it, and they called it the Mongoose instead of the Skyhawk. And he was in one of those, and that's a turning son of a gun for an airplane. And the Phantom is a known non-turner. It was a heavy wing loading, a really heavy wing load. If I remember right, something like 75 pounds per square foot was our wing loading. And so we could not turn with the MiGs. And so in this dogfight, I'm not going to be able to turn with that airplane. And so what you had to do, the Phantom had a much higher thrust-to-weight ratio than the MiGs did. So you'd fight a vertical fight. And so what I had to do was, while the Mongoose is flying a horizontal turning fight, much tighter than I can turn, I'd have to use the vertical. So swoop up high and then try to drop down on his 6 and then back up high again. Whatever you do not try to turn horizontally. Don't get slow with a MiG, and don't get slow with it. I thought I had a really good outcome for that mission because I did not shoot Randy down, but he did not shoot me down. Which I considered basically a huge victory on my part, to not get shot down by a Mongoose in my first sortie in Top Gun. So it was really fascinating to go through it all. And the way they describe it, it's described as a graduate course in fighter aviation. So certainly in dogfighting, but also in analysis of the threat. In our case, we were at that time worried about MiG-21s and MiG-17s in Vietnam. So what are their characteristics? How do we exploit them? How do we use our advantages where we have them and minimize our disadvantages? And also, how do the various weapons work? How do the various missiles work? What's our success rate with them and all of that? So it was a really fascinating course. And then the philosophy of it is that person who has been through Top Gun is to go back to their squadron and impart all this great knowledge that I have now to the rest of the guys in the squadron.
And you're still a junior guy, so they're just eager to hear whatever you have to say.
I'm still kind of a junior guy, but the job they gave me in the squadron was a very much desired one, and it was called Weapons Training Officer. And so I could talk dogfighting techniques. I could talk how we optimize everything, what the success rate is of the various missiles that we carry. Now, the Navy Phantoms never had guns. There was a thing called a Mark IV gun pod that I never carried, but it was so inaccurate that nobody used it. So we didn't have guns. So it was all the AIM-7 Sparrow missile and the AIM-9 Sidewinder. And of those two, the Navy didn't have really great success with the Sparrow. And I think it's because, and that which is a radar-guided missile. And part of it may have been because we're banging it on and off the carrier all the time. And so frequently they wouldn't even tune. You had to tune the missile to your particular radar. And you'd bring up the arm switch to try to tune the Sparrows, and half the time they wouldn't tune at all. And even if they did tune, when they used them, they had a minimum range that was far enough that they just weren't useful to us in a dogfight. The Sidewinder, on the other hand, was a heat seeker, infrared seeker on the nose of it that homed on the exhaust plume of the thing you were shooting at. We had great success with the Sidewinders. And so it was passing on all of that sort of information to the rest of the crews.
How long did Top Gun last? How long is the course?
Top Gun was basically 1 month, so 4-week course. And half the day was in academics, and the other half of the day was flying. So you flew every day. That was a great gig.
And so when you went back to the fleet and went back to the carrier, anything more you'd like to recall from your Southeast Asia experience, and then we can move on?
Well, the second cruise that I made in that squadron, in the F-4 Phantom squadron, was after the ceasefire had been signed. So there weren't any combat missions. We still did some photo escort missions. Anytime you'd send a photo bird out, it doesn't have any weapons at all. And so anytime we'd send out a photo reconnaissance F-8 Crusader, is what we had on the Coral Sea, we'd send a Phantom escort. So we got to fly some of those, and we were doing some photography, some photo reconnaissance, just to see what was going on in South Vietnam below the DMZ after the ceasefire. And there was plenty going on because they were getting ready to take South Vietnam. North Vietnam was going to take South Vietnam. I got back there one more time, and that was I made the first cruise of the F-14 Tomcat. And we were the first two Tomcat squadrons, Fighter Squadron 1 and Fighter Squadron 2. And we sailed aboard the Enterprise in September of '74 and went back to Southeast Asia. So we were offshore. We didn't fly any missions over land, but we were in the Tonkin Gulf, and we could kind of monitor what they were doing, and we could see that the end was going to be coming. And so at the end of that cruise, we were due to go home, I think, the first part of April of '75. Well, we got extended because South Vietnam was crumbling apart. The North had moved into the South, and they were taking it all over. And so it turns out my last combat mission was April the 30th, 1975, and that was covering the evacuation of Saigon. And
famous
so,
pictures of people on top of the embassy trying to get on the helicopter.
The helicopters landing at the embassy and landing on rooftops all over Saigon. I was overhead that day in a Tomcat, all armed up with missiles. And, of course, the Tomcat had a gun. We had the 20-millimeter Gatling gun, the M61, and all prepared for combat. There really wasn't any. It was called a combat mission, but I was overhead Saigon the very last day of the Vietnam conflict.
So you know what's going on and why you're there, and you have a job to do, but did you have any particular emotions, or are you just focusing on the airplane, seeing those evacuations and realizing what all this 10 years had come to?
It was a very sad day. It was a very somber day because the thought kept occurring to you that, look at how many Americans died. Look at how many Vietnamese died. Look at how many people died over the 10 years of that conflict.
My understanding is we just didn't have the political will to stop the second invasion or the second takeover of South Vietnam.
It's all true.
So they just blatantly violated the ceasefire, and we did nothing about it.
Right. Right. And it was so unpopular here at home that everybody wanted us out of there, come whatever. It was the sort of thing, and what did we do? We took it out on the warriors. We didn't take it out on the politicians that got us there. We didn't take it out on the leaders of the countries that were responsible for it. We took it out on the soldiers. And I won't forget that when I came home, there weren't any parades, there weren't any marching bands, there weren't any yellow ribbons or any of that sort of thing. And in fact, you were kind of reluctant. I remember one of my neighbors said, "Oh my gosh, I haven't seen you for months. Where you been?" You were reluctant to tell them.
Yes.
Because it was so unpopular. And they made us the bad guys. We were the bad guys.
Yeah, I remember talking to Doc Clement, who was a cat killer over there, and we talked about when he came home, and he said, all my friends, we would go out, and they'd say, "Tell us all about it." And 2 minutes later, they were shooting pool. They really didn't want to know about it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know what you could tell somebody. I mean, it was a beautiful country. The terrain was really interesting. The karst ridges, which are limestone ridges covered in jungle, it was really picturesque. And most of the time, you weren't enjoying the scenery.
Right.
You were going as fast as you could, and you were being shot at. You were being tracked by various radars. And so there was a lot of apprehension every time you were flying over North Vietnam.
Yeah, there was never really a war like that previous to Vietnam. I mean, where geography, or, you take this hill tomorrow, give it up, or take this hill today, give it up tomorrow. And it was, we were keeping score by casualties rather than who had what territory.
Oh, golly, yeah. Well, you mentioned take this hill today and lose it tomorrow and that sort of thing. I remember one time we were directed to go bomb a particular bridge, which was actually our bridge, but it had been taken over by them. And so go ahead and bomb that bridge today. So you had some strange things that happened. Yeah, hopefully we don't do that again.
Well, yeah, hopefully lesson learned. Well, there's been some interesting decisions since, but that's for another day. What happened next in your Navy career?
Well, the way I got to the F-14 Tomcats was I had made those 2 cruises, 1.5 cruises for me in the F-4 Phantom. And the F-14 Tomcat was just coming into the fleet. And I guess all of a sudden, it was realized that we didn't have enough junior pilots in the squadron, because everyone that had made their way into the F-14 Tomcats was so experienced and so senior that I think they looked around, they said, "Hey, you know what? We need some younger guys to stand all the duty watches and things like that, and all the integrity watches and shore patrol and stuff like that." So it was decided they wanted to add three younger pilots to each Tomcat squadron. And they asked all the commanding officers of the fighter squadrons, the F-4 Phantom squadrons and the F-8 Crusader squadrons, recommend one pilot. And so they had a bunch of names off the West Coast and a bunch of names off the East Coast, and they picked 6 pilots to go right into the F-14 Tomcat. So normally, a squadron tour you'd go to a squadron to be there for 2.5 or 3 years, and then you would go to shore duty for 2.5 or 3 years. So I had 2.5 years of sea duty, but then I got sent to the Tomcat squadron, so I had an extra long. I was one of the 3 that got picked off the West Coast to join the Tomcat squadrons, and then there were 3 off the East Coast. And so I had an extra long first fleet tour. And so then after that, it would be time for me to go to shore duty. So when I finished the cruise in the F-14 Tomcat, I wanted to go to test pilot school right then and there. And initially, I failed to screen for test pilot school. And here I am, I've got fleet experience in 2 different types of fighters and an aeronautical engineering degree, and I had done well in my squadrons. So we couldn't understand why I didn't screen for test pilot school. Well, meanwhile, what had happened was the Navy had decided that F-14 Tomcat training is so valuable and so expensive that once you're into the Tomcat, we're not letting you out. So they had not made me available for the screening. So my Air Wing commander was a big fan. He was a test pilot school graduate, and he pulled some strings to get my name to the commanding officer at test pilot school. And he went up to Washington, D.C., and put my application on the desk and said, "You're not letting us look at somebody like this." And so with all that help, I got selected to go to test pilot school.
You know, if you think back about it, you could have been in the Air Force, but by chance you ended up in the Navy. You were an unlikely choice for Top Gun. You were maybe surprised when you got chosen for the F-14. How much of your career path has been luck? I mean, once you had the opportunities, obviously you're a great aviator and you capitalized on them, but how much luck was involved in?
All of it. Sometimes I look at it and I say it was all luck, but I certainly had the desire and I had the zeal, and I worked really hard on everything, and I wanted to be the best I could possibly be. But the thing about so much of it is, you can't pick yourself for all of these things. You have to get picked by somebody else to go to Top Gun. You have to get picked by somebody else to go to test pilot school, and so on. You have to get picked by somebody else to get to be an astronaut. And so I think what it's done is it's helped me to realize how lucky I have been, how fortunate I have been that I got picked for all of those things. I've never had the inclination to sit back and say, well, okay, yeah, well, shoot, I'm so good, I got picked for all these things. No, I have been so lucky my entire career.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.